I think this is on. Yeah, okay. Thank you for your fellowship, all of you. Some of you have come a long way, and you certainly gave me a tall order asking me to speak on this. It's a very important subject, as Michael has just said, and we do need to think into it. In this first talk, I'm talking much more about the science. In the second talk, it will be more on the scriptures. So it's not going to be easy, because these things are not simple to actually deal with. So brace yourself for quite a lot of issues which are going across this subject, and it cannot just be resolved in just a few sentences. So my question is, who controls the climate? I am going to say some things on the scriptures. For instance, I'm going to answer this question primarily what the Bible says about the climate. And then I'm going to talk about climate science, alarmists, then something about the facts, then separating facts from assumptions, and then an important section here, supposing just for a moment that greenhouse gases are the cause, what would that imply? And there's some interesting issues there. Then I'm going to try and deal with the issue of what really may be causing the warming, and then false alarmism again and what is behind it, and conclusions. So, as was already mentioned in the introduction, Greta Thunberg and David Attenborough and many others have been basically saying the end is nigh, we've got to stop all the trouble caused by ruining the climate. But we need to ask the question, what does the Bible say about the climate? What says the scriptures? We're in a day when we wouldn't have thought, sort of 30, 40 years ago, that we would have to ask these questions. But we always turn to the scriptures to understand each issue that is faced before us, and we're certainly faced with this today. There was the worldwide flood in Genesis 6-9, which has already been referred to. At the end of the flood, the Lord actually promises that seed time and harvest will not be interrupted. And during the flood, it almost certainly included, although it doesn't say explicitly, volcanoes, which many of us, when we thought about the scientific implications of the flood, understand that to have warmed the oceans and spewed out ash into the atmosphere and caused what we think is the case, because there's lots of evidence of glaciation, that it was one great ice age which actually covered much of the northern hemisphere and possibly a little bit south. The pre-flood world is evidently lush, or was lush, with vegetation, and the post-flood world transitioned from lush to arid, particularly in obviously the big deserts that we have today. I want you to see that when the flood came, that was a massive climatic event. I'm going to be saying later that if you don't take a worldwide flood position, then it has big implications as to how you as a Christian, and I'm not doubting those who do take another position, I'm not saying they're not believers, they are believers, but it does affect the way you then address the issues of climate today. You see the point? So we need to understand that the Bible clearly teaches a worldwide flood. But then the Bible goes on to speak about the great famine in Canaan and what was to become Israel. And the famine was very grievous. And the Egyptians had the Nile to water their fields when the rains failed. But actually, there was famines in other places, as we shall see. There was a famine in the time of Isaac, and beside the first famine that was in the days of Abraham. And when we come to the time of Joseph, of course, there was a famine for many years in Joseph's time in Egypt, and it was only because he, as a godly prophet, knew what was coming, God had told him, and that he then provided food not only for the Egyptians but for many other lands around, including, of course, his brothers. We all know the story, and that's there in Genesis chapter 41. And it was a full 7 years, if you read the account, which didn't have rain. That was real climate change, but not due to industrial pollution. It is probably true that all the lands then inhabited came to Joseph, as I've already mentioned, for bread. Most droughts and famines were due to the Lord dealing either with his own people or the world at that time refusing to believe. So what I want you to see is that when you study the scriptures, it's very evident that who is controlling the climate? Not just the weather. Who's controlling long-term, years climate? It's the Lord himself. And we must draw that conclusion. We must not underestimate what the scriptures have already told us about climate before we address the issues today. Consider the time of Elijah. And it's quoted, of course, in James. And 1 Kings 17 verse 1, Elijah the Tishbite said unto Ahab, As the Lord God of Israel liveth, before whom I stand, there shall not be dew nor rain these years, but according to my word. And of course, he, as God's prophet, was dealing, yes, with Israel, but I've already shown you that God sometimes deals with other nations around as well. So you can't just say, well, it was just God's people. No, this was all the people were being affected, certainly in the previous examples. 3 more examples. Ruth chapter 1, you'll know that this wonderful love story which emerges between Ruth and Boaz actually begins with the deep sadness of Naomi. And it says that there was a famine in the land in the times of the judges. There was another example in 2 Samuel 21. There was a famine in the days of David. And this was years after Saul had attempted to kill the Gibeonites, and the Lord now, for some reason, he delayed the trouble, and it came in David's time, and David had to seek the Lord. And the Lord told him what the reason was, and you know the very, very sad events that had to take place with some of the descendants of Saul. The Lord was dealing with sin, not actually in that instance of David. And then we know there is no doubt that the Lord says that in the future, in the days, not necessarily now, but it could be that it's beginning. I'm not the one to unravel all the events that are going to take place in the future. None of us can, because the Lord says only the Father knows the day when Christ will return. But we do know that in Matthew 24, which is clearly speaking about the last days, it tells us nation shall rise against nation, kingdom against kingdom. There shall be famines, pestilences, earthquakes in divers places. And there's more to it, which I will refer to if I've just a few moments at the end. So there is no doubt that God controls the climate according to the Bible. Are you convinced? That was a very quick run over a number of scriptures. And if you want copies of these slides, I can make sure that they can get to you through James Skelton and the other members of the committee here. Once you study the scriptures, it gives you the framework, right? Particularly when you take the Old Testament carefully and where it's evident from the context, literally. And it's particularly important that you take a global worldwide flood position. Once you take that lens, as it were, which God has given us, right? We look at the scriptures, we assess them correctly, and then we begin to look at the issues of the day. That is always the Reformed evangelical position, and has been since the Reformation in 500 years ago. Well, let's turn then to what those are saying, like David Attenborough. And he obviously is firmly convinced that, we've got to do something about it. He was actually skeptical. We need to remember this. Back in 2006, there was an article written. I was skeptical about climate change. I was cautious about crying wolf. Well, fair dues. Give him his due that he was slow to come to the position he's taken. I believe he's come to the wrong position. But he says here, the thing that really convinced me was the graphs connecting the increase of carbon dioxide in the environment and the rise in temperature with the growth of human population and industrialization. The coincidence of the curves made it perfectly clear that we have left the period of natural climatic oscillation behind and have begun on a steep curve in terms of temperature rise beyond anything in terms of increases that we have seen over many thousands of years. So, a commentary on this says, like the Queen, Attenborough must resist being too opinionated. For a while, this meant he was wary of taking sides. And it says in 2018, about 15 years ago, a lecture by an American scientist, the late Ralph Cicerone, convinced him the evidence was beyond argument, and so on and so forth. And these people are not saying things which are totally off the wall. Please be careful about sweeping statements which immediately say, oh, they're totally wrong. What they're saying is that there is a greenhouse effect, and indeed, if there wasn't, we would be frigid. So we wouldn't be here. Basically, the Lord has made the atmosphere such that some of the radiation, which the sun obviously is giving to this planet, is kept, as it were, rather like a greenhouse, where instead of glass, it's like the atmosphere is acting as that glass. You don't need to go into all the figures, but if you want the slides later, here's one which is from one of the authors, which speaks about the numbers of watts per meter squared and all the rest of it. So you can do an energy balance on the whole globe, and you can see that there is a greenhouse effect. Now, they, of course, get alarmed, these people, David Attenborough and Greta Thunberg and many of the others, get alarmed as you constantly hear reports of the Arctic ice gradually being removed. And they play videos like this one, which shows what's happening over the years, and the years are plotted down there from 1970s right up to, well, this is a few years old. It goes into the early 2000s up to 2010. And it is true that the ice in the North Pole has begun to shrink quite considerably. And it has been said by Al Gore, although he was wrong, that all the ice would dissipate by about 2013, mid-2010s. But of course that didn't happen, because we still do have the ice today. He was overstating the case. We certainly know that the melting of the ice has taken place. We cannot deny that. So let's be careful here about being alarmed. That's my point at this moment. But nevertheless, we don't go around trying to say that those facts are incorrect. We're also quite in tune with the statement that the carbon dioxide level has increased. I'm not one for denying some of the evidence, although you need to be careful here, because some of the curves are exaggerated. We shall see that in a moment. And some of the statements are based not on observations, but based on computer predictions. And that's where you need to be exceedingly careful, because those predictions are always a product of what you put into the program. So you need to separate that which is observed, and even with that which is observed, sometimes the data is well, I'll be kind and I'll use the word manipulated, right? So you need to be very careful. And that's why it took me a while to dig through quite a few papers, where I tried to understand what people were saying. The lecture which convinced David Attenborough in 2004 was one which presented the data in this way. It showed, it's very difficult to read for you there, but the red curve is the carbon dioxide level, and the blue curve is the movement in temperature. So there is, if you can see there, you can see a blue curve which is almost on top of the red curve. And of course, the blue curve, which is the change in temperature, is actually moving quite considerably at the end. So if we look at this next set of graphs, and please do note that a lot of this you need to be careful with, because they are talking about ice cores. And ice core data, and I'm going to put another graph up here of ice cores. It's very difficult for you to take all this just in one lecture, but the ice core data itself has an issue, because the ice core data is not measuring temperature directly. It's actually measuring an isotope of oxygen and then making an assumption to work out what they think the temperature would have been when the ice was laid. In other words, it's not a direct measurement. So we need to be exceedingly careful about data which comes from ice cores. And of course, the dates are wildly wrong, because we know that the Bible tells us that we've only been here of the order of 6,000 years. We also know that the Bible tells us that there was a major dramatic event of the order of 4,500 years ago, which is the worldwide flood. I've just told you that the Bible implies, doesn't say explicitly, but all the data strongly suggests that there was a massive ice age after the flood, which would be somewhere in the region of about 4,100 or going backwards, 4,200 years ago, or in that region, okay? So that would have laid down ice at an enormous level, which of course is reinterpreted by secular scientists as regards thousands upon thousands of millimeter thick, or maybe to give them their due, they might actually say centimeters thick, but they will reinterpret what is meters of ice, laid probably just over 1 year, to be thousands of years of what we would call sublayers. Well, I'll come to that if there's time. So let me just move on here and just look at this blue set of writing here, because I'm summarizing this ice core issue. Despite appearances, charts such as these are not strong arguments either for an old Earth or for the, I'll come to it, an astronomical theory as to what is causing climate change. There are large assumptions concerning the dating of the ice cores, which I've just mentioned. The temperature changes are not directly measured. They are inferred, which I just mentioned to you, from the isotopes of oxygen. It's the oxygen isotope, not 16, but 18, right? And it's the ratio of that with the isotope, the 16 one, which we have in the air at the moment. And they can work out then, they think, what the temperature was at that time. The data, in fact, simply shows fluctuations during the one ice age after the flood and the slow loss in the ice volume since the single ice age. Now let's just come back to more recent times, because of course they're saying this is many hundreds of thousands of years, which we wouldn't accept. This is the famous hockey stick graph, right, which was produced by a chap called Michael Mann, and he, in conjunction with others, was saying the temperature, guys, since the last 1,000 years has never been at the level it is now in terms of the global temperatures. But the problem with that graph, as others were disputing with him, and indeed there were court cases going on between him and a chap called Professor Ball, I've read round it and looked at one or two videos on these discussions and court cases, but essentially it is true that he was not telling things in an, certainly I'll be kind to him, not in an open way. He had manipulated or adjusted the data, because what really he hadn't taken account of was that there was what's called a medieval warm period, which was from about 1000 to 1300 or thereabouts. And then it became a temperature very, very low in what we call the Little Ice Age period. And so when he says we've never been here before, he wasn't strictly right. We know that in that beginning of the Little Ice Age period, things were very, very cold. We don't have such cold winters now, but even I can remember that winters were a lot colder in my youth. And and of course, in those times, both over on the continent and of course in England, rivers were freezing over, even the big rivers like the Thames, and frost fairs were taking place a bit later in the 1800s. So the correction of that Manning graph is that one, where you can see that the understanding of what was happening in the past, and of course it's not easy to know exactly what the temperatures were, but it's estimated by many that in the preceding time, which is the early 1400s, 1000 up to about 1400, the temperatures were a lot higher. And then it went into this Little Ice Age period. So the correct temperature plot is this one, and that is the one which was not really acknowledged by Professor Manning. So please be aware that you need to be careful about believing everything that is said to you concerning even what is reckoned by the majority of secular scientists to be facts when they're not facts. So coming back then to this matter of this ice core data, and the fact that the temperature seems to have gone up quite considerably in recent days, and we're not denying that, and that the carbon dioxide levels have also gone up together. What then is causing this? You remember I mentioned the greenhouse gases. Well, suppose for a moment that the greenhouse gases are the cause. I'm going to, in a little bit later in this talk, actually show you evidence which, to my mind, suggests strongly that it's not greenhouse gases which is driving it, right? That's going to be my conclusion. I'll tell you where I'm going. But just for a moment, let's consider the possibility that this greenhouse effect is the issue. And let's now separate facts from the statements made which give alarmism, right? That's what I'm attempting to do in this little section. So you with me? Have you gone to sleep yet? Can you put your hand up if you've gone to sleep? Okay, right. Just checking that you're all with me. I don't know whether you have ice creams, but we might need them. Because the science does, I'm having to dig into the science. I want to show you that you've got to be thorough. You cannot just, in a few paragraphs, deal with this on the bus going to work with a friend. You need to actually say, have you read into this in depth? That's really what you need to be asking people if you're going to conduct a conversation. And I would be careful about making sweeping statements unless you feel that you can actually back them up carefully. Now, supposing greenhouse gases are the cause, and supposing we address this issue that maybe we're producing too much of one of those gases, which, as you know, is always carbon dioxide. People talk about what's your carbon footprint and all the rest of it. Even some of my family have said that in the past to me. So what's your carbon footprint like, Andrew? You know. But let's just be careful here. One of the major greenhouse gases, and I'm saying if greenhouse gases are the issue, what is the major greenhouse gas which causes this effect? Did you know the major one is water vapor? It's not carbon dioxide. The major one is water vapor. And of the man-made gases, it is true that we make a fair amount of carbon dioxide, but we're going to see that the percentage of that is actually not as great as people reckon. Come with me to look now at the large contribution of water vapor, which was completely missing when the Department of Energy, the US Department of Energy, mentioned a table of greenhouse gases, didn't include water vapor, and then came out with the conclusion that the percentage of the total was significantly man-made, and that carbon dioxide, both man-made and natural, was 99% of the cause of the greenhouse phenomenon. That was simply wrong. You see, the man-made effect is obviously going to be smaller, but it was pretty significant in that chart. The correct table is this one, because when you put water vapor in there, then water vapor takes 95% of all the gases which are causing the greenhouse phenomenon. Carbon dioxide is about between 3 and 4%, right? Then you've got to work out what is the man-made contribution of the carbon dioxide, which it's alleged is causing all the trouble. Well, we work out that the man-made contribution to CO2 is only just over 3% of all the carbon dioxide. So if you know anything about the maths, what you've got to do is you've got to multiply the effect of the gases, then multiply those two figures together in order to get the man-made contribution to the carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. So basically what I'm saying is you've got to multiply the 3.2% times the 3.6%, and you end up with this hugely small level of 0.117%, if you want the exact numbers, of what is man-made carbon dioxide affecting the environment. So man-made CO2 is a very, very tiny percentage of the total of the greenhouse gases causing the possibility of trouble in the atmosphere. Are you with me? And the reason primarily is because I've included the 95%, which is water vapor, right? Then I've said, of that small little percentage of carbon dioxide left, which is just a few percent, we ourselves are only providing a very small percent again. So you've got to multiply those two numbers if you're going to be really honest about what's happening with the CO2. So the reality is that man-made carbon dioxide has a minuscule effect on the overall situation which the Lord has given us. He produced water vapor in the way that it operates today. He produced the balance of the gases in the atmosphere that we have today, which is roughly 21 or just under 21% of oxygen, and mainly, as you know, 79% of nitrogen. But he also has a significant amount, even in that small percentage, of water vapor, and the condensation of that water vapor produces clouds. And by the way, did you know that the IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, when it does its models, has still not properly taken account of water vapor. So how can they possibly be making really accurate predictions when the major cause of greenhouse phenomenon is water vapor? They haven't taken account yet in their massive programs, taking huge supercomputers, which would probably occupy this whole church, right? And it's a big problem because you're dealing with the whole world and you're dealing with accuracy, and that's very, very difficult to get down to, real accuracy of modeling. And you've got to model the condensation of water vapor in the atmosphere. And that's a very difficult thing to do. Even the best weather forecasting still takes a lot of work to do that. So what then is the cause of global warming? Let me now move on. I've suggested to you that if it was greenhouse gases, then there's something not right in the way that they produce the data or produce the results of their data. They're not taking account of the big issue of water vapor, right? Now I'm going to suggest to you that it's not actually to do with greenhouse gases. Now I'm holding my position tentatively, right? I'm not saying that there is no effect of man-made global warming. There may be a small effect, so we shouldn't just completely ignore what we do. And I'm going to come to an argument in the end that simply for environmental purposes, simply for encouraging and recognizing that we should be good stewards of God's creation, there is another motive for actually being careful about the way we avoid polluting the planet for those reasons, not so much to do with the warming, which I'm now talking about. So actually, I'm coming to a conclusion, which is that even though I'm not with the camp which is of climate alarmism, we should nevertheless be good stewards of that which God has given us, right? So please note the way that I'm looking into this. Now, what is the cause of global warming? Well, when you actually look at those ice core data, which is the background picture at the top right, and now you look closely, right, at somebody's work where they very carefully looked at the ice cores. So I'm looking at their own data, right? They, of course, believe in hundreds of thousands of years of continuous ice formation due to many ice ages, which they link with an astronomical theory, which is to do with the wobble of the Earth going around the sun, which we call Milankovitch cycles, right? That's the way they work. But just saying, okay, that's what they're doing. But let's just look. This gentleman said, in Müller, a German gentleman, and we're looking at time running from the right to the left here. And I wish I had my pointer, which I didn't bring up from the back there. But if you look very carefully here and look at this diagram, you'll see that you've got 4 peaks of the carbon dioxide at the bottom of the picture, right? This is quite an important picture because this is not from Christians. Thank you. It's a pointer, is it? Thank you. Oh, that's great. Good. So we're looking at this picture. So you've got carbon dioxide here, right? And they say that carbon dioxide goes up first, and then that leads to temperature rise. But look at this. Temperature goes up. It's not so marked on the first one, but the second one, it's certainly marked. There's the temperature, and there's the carbon dioxide. There's the temperature. Time's going from right to left. There's the temperature, and there's the carbon dioxide. The fourth one, it's very marked. The temperature's going up first, and then the carbon dioxide goes up. Now, that's not the only example. There are other, when you dig into the data, something else is beginning to become apparent. And that is what you would expect. I should have brought my water bottle up here, which is a fizzy water one. But if you heat water, which has got carbon dioxide in, you know what happens? The carbon dioxide comes out of a fizzy water bottle, right? If you put that fizzy water onto the cooker, right, and heat it, obviously it starts fizzing anyway because it will come up anyway at any temperature. But if you start raising the temperature, it will really come up because the carbon dioxide will come out much more as you heat it. The oceans are roughly 3/4 of the land surface, of the whole surface of the globe. So if you start heating the water, that will produce carbon dioxide. Okay, so I'm suggesting to you that it's not carbon dioxide which is driving it. So what is the cause of global warming? Well, NASA certainly thinks that it's carbon dioxide. But even when you look at their data, that data, which in this case is plotting, it's plotting at the top the temperature, and in this case they're not talking about carbon dioxide. They're trying to tell us that it's nothing to do with the sun's energy reaching the earth, which we call total solar irradiance, TSI. Okay, so this particular plot, this is NASA no less, which is trying to tell us there's no connection. Well, when you actually dig into what they've done here, somebody actually looked at that very red curve, the same one that we just showed on the previous slide, this one, and it's essentially the same curve. And they said, let's actually look at testing the models that they've already produced, looking backwards on the data that we have already got. In other words, we'll test whether their temperatures were actually matching the data in the past, and they weren't. Not very well at all. So are we really to believe them when they actually look at the future? So I'm putting a big doubt onto the NASA curve. Even though NASA is a very big, huge US organization, they've got swept up with, I'm going to suggest, a political motive, because they know that their funding would be questioned if they started challenging what really is going on. And some scientists are challenging it, not necessarily people who would agree with us as Christians, and certainly not believing in creation. So let's come back to that curve again. And this time I'm going to look at the yellow curve, which is the total solar irradiance. Now, people have put together the total solar irradiance, which is this curve here. You don't need to worry too much about trying to read that. You can't possibly read it, but actually it's going back to the 1600s through to the year 2000. So we need to blow that up a bit if we're going to compare it with the roughly 1980s through to 2000. And what I've done here is I've blown up that total solar irradiance curve to show that something has gone wrong here. That what has happened is that I want to be kind to these people, they may have a motive, but basically the data is not agreeing with what you really find when you dig into the data. So that red curve and that yellow curve are actually much closer than NASA was trying to make out. That's the point I'm making here. So what is the cause of global warming? Well, this now gets very interesting. This comes from a lot of work which was done with, there's a gentleman called Nir Shaviv, who is an Israeli scientist, and he has put his head over the parapet and said, I don't think it's carbon dioxide at all. He doesn't accept a Christian position. He believes very much in the ice core data being over hundreds of thousands of years. But he has come to the conclusion that it's something to do with the sun which is driving it. And I would suggest that although that is often mocked at, if I was to say that in a climate conference run by secular scientists, you would get laughed out of court. In fact, you wouldn't even have a platform to say it. That is the problem. Serious climate scientists like Nir Shaviv cannot even get a platform to say it, let alone folks such as me who believe in a young Earth and don't accept, the ice core data anyway as being over hundreds of thousands of years. Now, this is interesting. People have measured the temperature of the contiguous, that is, the whole of the landmass of the USA, includes Canada as well. And it's looking at the averaged temperature. They've looked at the same with the Arctic. And there's been some Chinese scientists who've looked at China. And what is very, very interesting is that independent land masses concur that the fluctuations in this total solar irradiance, that's the amount of energy reaching the Earth in their area, is going very similar to the temperature changes over the same period, which is strongly suggesting that there is a link between solar activity and the rise which has taken place in carbon dioxide. Now, we don't know all the answers here. We don't quite know why it's happening this way at this juncture. But I'm going to suggest to you what may be a clue to it. So I'm not denying that there is a rise in carbon dioxide. I'm not denying that there may be some effect from humans. But it's not the alarmist approach which really is going to do any good in the real science. It's actually just going to lead us down blind alleys. If we just, basically what's happening is people are following where the money is. And of course, if all the governments are saying, this is what we need to do, guys, then everybody's got to kowtow to the overall ideology which is coming over and bow down to the idol of that particular group of people, because they're going to be the paymasters to pay them for the next 10 years, 20 years of research. That's what's going on. I've been in that research environment. I know that's the way universities work. I'm sorry to actually be a little bit cynical there, but that is, you can expect it, that people are not going to find it easy to go in another direction once great big political statements have been made. So now let's look at solar activity. Now, solar activity is all to do with sunspots. And there is an 11-year cycle in the sun. And when there is more activity, then there is more sunspots. Less activity, less sunspots. And when we actually look at this over, you can actually go back to not just the 1960s, but you can actually go back to the time of Herschel, which is much further back in terms of centuries. And there's quite a lot of observations which were going on in China and other places. So you can actually build up quite an important picture here of sunspot activity. Now, this is where, again, everything, other bits of evidence is now corroborating the sunspot idea as being pertinent. We don't quite know what was the link between sunspot activity and the heating up of the Earth. In other words, to be fair to those who oppose this theory, right, you cannot just simply say, oh, look, it's the amount of energy reaching the Earth which has changed. No, it's not. It's much more subtle than that. Because the total solar irradiance change is actually not a lot. You cannot get enough energy from just the change of direct radiation. It's something else which is indirectly linked to the change in solar activity, right? So this is why proper research has to dig and get to the bottom of what's going on. But they haven't got enough money to do it because all the money is flowing in another ideological direction. Do you get it? Okay? But this is certainly relevant, because when you actually gather all the data, it is well known that there was much less sunspot activity when? In that period called the Little Ice Age. Even Herschel noted it, the astronomer at the time. He said, it seems to be that when the sunspot activity is greater, the price of wheat goes up. And he couldn't understand it, but he could see that there was something to do with the energy level reaching the Earth in some way, which was changing. So we call this the Maunder minimum. And so this suggests strongly that it's to do with the sun. But we don't quite understand what it is that's going on, which is why we need more research here. Let me come back to the IPCC, the International Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. And this raises now yet another issue, and that is what we call sensitivity. When they do their models, they have to say, well, we're going to put in X% due to man-made, and you can see they make that X very, very big, that big bar across the top. You can't see the writing here. That is man-made CO2, right? They call it radiative forcing by emissions and drivers. So they say that man-made production of CO2 or other, even natural production of CO2 is causing it. And when it comes to the sun, which is here, I'm sorry you can barely read this, but this is the bit due to the sun, it's tiny, right? So in their models, they do not take account, I've already said, of water vapor properly, and they don't take account of the proper effect of the sun. Now you might say, well, they've got every reason not to, because the actual radiation change, is not a lot. But it actually indirectly is causing a lot, as we shall see in a few moments as I just come to the conclusion of this talk. So you could get this chart from me if you wish to have it, and I can send you to the original website where I got it. But I just need to mention in passing that another point here is that the effect of volcanic eruptions also seems to be connected with the rise and fall of global temperatures. When you get a lot of eruptions like Pinatubo just recently in the last 30 or 40 years in the Philippines, it caused a cooling in the earth. So if you have a volcanic eruption, you get cooling, right? So that's yet another effect which hasn't been dealt with. Now, as I draw this talk to a close, I'm coming to a climax, which is my contention is, as a number of scientists have said, that it's to do with the sun. But it's not as simple as saying, well, we've got more energy coming in, therefore the Earth's going to heat up. No, it's not a direct effect. It's an indirect effect. We know also that what correlates with the change in the solar cycle is cosmic radiation. Now this is an important link. The effect of cosmic rays is these tiny little rays coming from outer space reach the water vapor. They cause a nucleus, which causes condensation on them. So once you have more cosmic radiation, it changes the cloud cover, right? Now what is it that the solar activity does? Well, the solar activity does, and this is near Chavez's work, this is a very, very thought-provoking argument, and I think he's on the right track, but I'm not going to say conclusively it's all been proved, because people will argue tooth and nail against near Chavez in the climate discussions. It's not just the total solar irradiance, which of course the IPCC has already dismissed because it's such a small change. It's actually what happens is that normally the sun, when it's not producing this sunspot activity, just will cause it to be much cooler global temperatures, because there is a relatively weak solar magnetic field. But when you get a lot of sunspot activity, you've got a strong solar wind, as it's called, right? And the solar wind then causes the Earth to heat up because the cosmic rays are shifted away, you're getting it, shifted away from the Earth. So it's an indirect effect of the sunspot or the solar activity and the sunspot 11-year cycle. That's what CViE is suggesting. And some creation scientists that from the Institute of Creation Research, people like Larry Vardaman, have also begun to think that that is what's connected. So very interestingly, and I'll hurry through this because I want to finish, this first talk is coming to an end. But what I want you to see is that how interesting that when he correlates the effect of solar activity with the sea level rise, there is a correlation. Not because of the direct effect of the sun on the planet, but he suspects that it's the indirect effect of this cosmic radiation and the heating up of the Earth. In other words, there seems to be definitely correlations in a number of areas between sunspot activity and, importantly, with sea level rise. Remember Al Gore saying, you're going to have billions die because the coasts are going to be, removed from all the sea's going to come in onto the land in all Bangladesh and many other areas. Huge alarmism. But actually he's saying, yeah, there is a sea level correlation, but it's due to the cosmic radiation, which is changing, and therefore, as I told you just earlier, correlated with the solar activity, which does cause a change in the sea level rise. So, what is a correct picture that should have been used? It's this one. When you actually take account of the real effect of the sun, which is there in the data, if only it would be believed properly, the proper chart that the IPCC should be using is this one for the sun. That there seems to be a major effect due to the sun, and much less effect, actually, they've put a massive percentage on the man-made carbon dioxide. Well, somebody once said, reality is only an illusion, albeit a very persistent one. You're meant to laugh at that. Do you know who said it? Albert Einstein. In other words, facts get in the way, don't they, of neat theories. You need to be very, very careful jumping to conclusions. The whole world is jumping to a conclusion. It's very difficult to go in the other direction. We don't dismiss everything that serious thinking climate scientists are saying. But what I am saying is, there is sufficient data to say there is something going on to do with how the Lord has regulated our nearest star, which clearly is the major drive to all the conditions that we have here on this world. Just let me show you that the number of wildfires, by the way, is not what people think today. Oh, far more than there ever was. No, not in the US. What actually they show is, as is indicated here, the public are not shown this bit. They're just shown this bit from 1960 to the 2020s as we're coming up on this graph. But they'd never tell you that there was huge acreage burnt in the US many, many decades before. So what is behind this alarmism? Well, I think this says it all. This is the chairman of, or was the chairman of the IPCC. He says, we redistribute de facto the world's wealth by climate policy. One has to free oneself from the illusion that international climate policy is environmental policy. That's a huge admission, isn't it? This has almost nothing to do with environmental policy. anymore. I find that very striking. That's a real admission, is it not? I tell you, friends, we need to rethink. My conclusions are, I'll put them all up here, that there are many unproven assessments in the secular assessment of climate. Much data is hidden, such as the effect, as I mentioned, of water vapor on greenhouse gases. The IPCC models, the mathematical models, computer models, do not take account of clouds and the known effect of solar activity. There is credible evidence, I'm not going to put it stronger than that, because research is still going on, but there is credible evidence that solar activity combined with cosmic radiation, that's the work of this brilliant Israeli scientist, could be the cause of warming. Beware of hype and alarmism. The Lord controls all things. It says in Hebrews chapter 1 verse 3, he upholds all things, including the climate, as we saw at the beginning, by the word of his power. And that should be the Christian's position. Genesis 8, which we had read earlier, says, while the earth remains, seed time and harvest, and cold and heat, and summer and winter, and day and night shall not cease. Well, there is an end coming. It says in Matthew 24 that when the Lord returns, and I'm not going to go into detail because we'll all have different positions, I'm just emphasizing the major fact that Christ is coming back. We all agree on that? The sun will be darkened, the moon shall not give a light, the stars fall from heaven, the powers of the heavens shall be shaken. And then shall appear the sign of the Son of Man in heaven, and then shall all the tribes of the earth mourn. And they shall see the Son of Man coming in the clouds of heaven with power and glory, great glory. The Lord of glory is returning. Whatever those celestial events are, I just put an eclipse up there, but it is obviously more than an eclipse. There's something very, very powerful going to happen. The Lord is in control, and the Lord personally is coming back. Let me ask you, are you living in the light of that return? Have you personally trusted the Lord Jesus Christ here in this audience? Have you believed in the Lord Jesus who bled and died for you, that you might be forgiven? Have you personally said, Lord, I wish to follow you for the rest of my days, and I repent of my sins, and I believe that Jesus Christ, who died on the cross to take the sin of all those who would trust in him, is the one who is in control now and is going to return? It has a major effect on the way you look at the people around you, including those lost souls in the IPCC who need winning for Christ. We need to love them. We need to listen to them. Don't go off at the deep end saying, oh, I've been to this talk and I heard this. Just get to grips with the data yourself if you're going to talk to them about the science. Read up on it carefully. Come to your own conclusions. If you want the books, there they are. Number of books. There's Climate Change and Global Warming, which Simon has got on the AIG bookstore. Very interesting book, just come out, A Different Shade of Green by Gordon Wilson, by a person who does believe in a young earth position, says that we still need to have a view on the environment, which I'll come to in the second talk. Very interesting book by, I tried to remember his name, Professor Carter, Climate, the Counter Consensus. Very interesting. He's not a Christian, but he's died now, but he put over a very interesting view. And then, well worth going to the Creation Ministries International website, where there's a very interesting article by Don Batten on anthropogenic global warming. Is it true? And he comes to the conclusion it's not. So both answers in Genesis Creation Ministries International have thought into this a lot, and so has Institute of Creation Research, which is the bottom article, A New Theory of Climate Change, which you could download from the Institute of Creation Research. So there you go. Thank you for listening so carefully. It's a big subject, and you gave me a big job to do. But I'm very grateful for it, actually, because it's made me think a huge amount. I hadn't realized what this Israeli scientist was saying. And once I got onto him, I thought, wow, he's onto something here. It needs more research. We need to pray that the Lord might yet turn the tide. I don't know whether he will, of opinion. It may be that he's going to say, no, this is the beginning when there's a great deception. Who knows? We don't know when the Lord is returning back. But turn and pray to the Lord to give you wisdom as to how you speak to the younger generation, particularly, who really absorbed this hook, line and sinker. And I'll say more about that in the second talk.
Right.